Hello, New Prospect. Welcome to RTB 2021 for November the 25th, 2021. Hope you're doing well today. And happy Thanksgiving to all you guys. I am certainly thankful this year for so many things. Obviously, family and our church family. But I'm very much thankful for what God is doing through New Prospect Baptist Church. And I'm thankful for so many of you guys who are so dedicated to the cause of Christ. And you're such an inspiration to me, and I know to Drew and Jay and April and Susan and Bobby and Joel and April and Elisa and Patty and all the folks who are on staff serving. We are grateful to serve with you in the kingdom of God here at New Prospect Baptist Church, and we're excited about what God has in store for the future for our covenant community of faith that we call New Prospect Baptist Church. So thankful for that. And of course, we are thankful most of all for the gospel of Jesus Christ that saves. So Luke, text for today, we got Luke 9, we've got Jonah 4, we're finishing up the book of Jonah, 1 Peter 2, and then finally we have 1 Chronicles 21. So let's start with Luke here, Luke 9. So this is kind of a turning point in all three of the synoptic gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We find this to be the kind of the turning point in Jesus's ministry, just several months now before Jesus is crucified, before his resurrection, before those culminating and climactic events in the life of Christ. But here's a turning point in that ministry where from this point onward, everything seems to be heading towards that one event. It's all eyes are now pointed towards the cross after this event. And what's so significant about this event, the events, particularly in the last part of this chapter, of course, is that these events, both the Transfiguration and the confession of Peter at Caesarea Philippi, both of these events focus in on Jesus and his identity. So, of course, at Caesarea Philippi, this very pagan city, was one that had many temples and altars to pagan deities there. In the midst of all that, he asks his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And of course, Peter answers, "You're the Christ of God." And then, of course, after he identifies himself as the Christ of God, then he starts to teach about how he will suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed and raised on the third day. Integral to his identity is this work that he would perform for us, which is, of course, his work on the cross. This, of course, is one that upsets the disciples, although it's not really spoken of here as much as it is in the other synoptic gospels. But here it focuses in on, once again, and we see this in all the gospels, where Jesus teaches on his work, his identity, what he would do, and then he teaches on discipleship after that. Remember, the purpose of that is ultimately because discipleship is becoming like the discipler. So if we're going to be like the discipler, we need to understand who he was and what he was like. Well, he is the one who gave up his life for us, and so we should also be ones who deny ourselves, take up our cross daily, and follow him. Then you have, of course, the Transfiguration, and in the Transfiguration, once again, we also have God, in this case, giving his stamp of approval and also his identification of Jesus as his son. Going back to 2 Samuel 7, that's a messianic title, his chosen one, listen to him. Now, it's interesting that, of course, in the baptism, it says, "This is my beloved son in whom I'm well pleased." Now we have an exhortation instead of the affirmation we get in that first baptism. And so this is, I think, of course, addressed to those disciples and ultimately to us, but to those disciples, listen to Jesus, especially in these last moments of his life that they have with him. And there's much more that we can talk about, but again, right after that, it starts talking more about discipleship and And discipleship, notice how many times when it talks about discipleship, it talks about following Jesus. That's really what discipleship is, right? It's becoming like the discipler, but it's also following after him in our hearts and our lives. And that starts, for instance, in verse 57, where it talks more about that. So that's Luke 9. We'll turn over to 1 Peter chapter 2. And again, we've been here in 1 Peter before, and there's much we could talk about here. You have the text about honoring authority, human authorities that have been placed over us. This is perhaps even more important for today's world than it is. Well, I'm sure there were many times in history and church history where this was important, especially in that first century context when they're being ruled by a wicked empire like the Roman Empire. And yet he still says, submit yourselves for the sake of the Lord to every human institution, whether to king or whether to a king as one in authority or to governors or whatever. So I think we can probably do the same, right? Then it also talks about Jesus as our example at the end of this chapter, but I always love the discussion that we have in 1 Peter 2, 9 through 10, which is quoting from Exodus 19 and some other Old Testament texts, and from Hosea as well, that we are those people who have received mercy, and now we have the same assignment and role that ancient Israel had. Remember, Israel was a nation that was placed among the nations to be a light to the nations. And so when God calls them to himself at Mount Sinai, he gives them that purpose to be the light to the nations. And the phrase he uses there is a kingdom of priests. And so in the same way, the church has that same role. We have been placed among the nations to be a light to the nations. There's a theology of geography. There's a reason why we are placed where we are. There's a reason why you live in Anderson, South Carolina, or wherever you live. Whoever is listening to this, I'm sure we have some folks scattered around across the Southeast and even further perhaps. But wherever you live, wherever God calls you, you are placed there for that purpose. And what is the purpose? To proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. I love this text in 1 Peter 2:9. Let's move over to Jonah. All right, so in Jonah, actually, let's go over to 1 Chronicles. So 1 Chronicles 21 is the story of David's census of his people, and this is the one account in the book of Chronicles that's somewhat negative towards David. Although the reason why the author includes it here is because the temple is so significant for him as well. And of course, it's a census that brings a plague upon the people in punishment for it. That it's a census that ultimately leads to the choosing of the place where the temple would stand. And so where the census ends, that's where the temple, after David prays for the census, where the plague ends, after David prays for that plague to end, that's where David says that's going to be the place that my son will put the temple. And of course, he ends up purchasing that. That's a little bit of a detail that's not included in the Samuel text. Another thing that's not included in the Samuel text is, it's actually included, but there's a little bit of an adjustment here. In 1 Chronicles 21, it says in verse 1, it says, now Satan stood up against Israel and moved David to number Israel. If you turn over to 1 Samuel, where this occurs, and that's in 2 Samuel, where this occurs. And I may have even talked about this when we talk about 2 Samuel, but it says in 2 Samuel 24, if I can get there, 2 Samuel 24, now the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and it incited David against them to say, go and number Israel and Judah. So which is it? Is it Satan that stood up against Israel and moved David to number Israel? Or is it the anger of the Lord? Maybe it's both. Now the phrase here, Satan, this gets a little bit technical, is the Hebrew word Satan, but it actually has the article attached to it, the Satan. Literally, that word Satan means adversary. And I think Satan probably here is not the best translation. I'm not so sure that this is Satan the way we think of Satan, but this is an adversary that's standing up against Israel. Probably a foreign nation. And probably what's happening here is that when David sees this foreign nation, he desires to take a census, right? This is what you would do if you were being faced with an enemy. And apparently this is against the will of the Lord, which is why the anger of the Lord burns against David, 2 Samuel 24. And this is why ultimately God punishes David. Otherwise, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense why God is burning, has his anger burning against David. So anyway, and I think this Chronicles passage kind of clarifies what's going on there by using that phrase. So anyway, but it does show once again the author of the chronicler's emphasis on the hope of Israel being not only in David but also in God being with his people once again, being among his people. And of course, what ultimately happens is God, through his Messiah, is with his people, right? So there's, and we've talked about that before, where the temple and the Davidic king are merged in the person of Jesus Christ. And then finally, we have Jonah 4. This is where Jonah finally sees the repentance of the Assyrians, and we see his response. Doesn't make him happy, does it? And he ends up quoting, he says, I knew you're a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abounding in loving kindness, one who relents concerning calamity. So this is a quotation from Exodus 34, 6 and 7 that I always make my students memorize because it's such an important text for understanding the character of God in the Old Testament. This is a text that informs so many texts in the Old Testament. And when it comes to the actual specific character traits of God. And of course, that Exodus 34 passage is when Moses asked God to reveal himself, and he reveals himself as a God who is compassionate, gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love, and yet not forgiving those who commit forgiving those who commit iniquity, but also holding those who commit iniquity to account. But this is a character trait of God that upsets Jonah because once again it's being extended to the Assyrians. And this is ultimately what Jonah cannot accept. He cannot accept that. He does not accept that that divine grace is extended. He's happy to have divine grace when it's extended to him. That's the booth, for instance, that God creates for him here, even when he's angry. But he doesn't want it extended to the Assyrians. In fact, here at the end, he says, where is it? The overarching question of this story is verse 11, should I not have compassion on Nineveh? And really that's the message of the book. He does not have to show, he shows compassion on whomever he will, put it that way. It's a message of hope. If God responds graciously to Nineveh, then no one is without hope of forestalling judgment. There is hope for grace even when the sentence has been passed. Even here's this hope for grace, even when you are the worst of the worst. And so the book of Jonah is a neat book on the compassion of God, but also I think is a book that targets those attitudes that we can sometimes have as well. We want justice so much that we want people to be punished, and yet when God extends his grace to them, sometimes that doesn't make us happy. So we need to be those who see things through God's eyes, see him as this compassionate God that extends compassion on whomever he will. I think that's it. 1 Chronicles 21, we did 1 Peter 2, Jonah 4, and then Luke 9. Very good. Hope you have a great Thanksgiving. Hope you have a wonderful time with your family and friends, and don't eat too much today, right? And thankful for our church, and thankful for you guys on this day. November 25th, 2021.